August, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really, really excited for this conversation, and I have so many questions. Okay, let's start with your ADHD diagnosis. I guess, how long ago were you diagnosed, and what was happening in your life at the time that really led you to think I should look into this, or, really helped you kind of connect those dots?
Yeah. So I'm in my early 40s now, I guess almost mid 40s now. And I was diagnosed at about age 30. And what led me, I wasn't actually thinking, oh, maybe I have ADHD. I was just trying to figure out, once again, what was wrong with me. Like, that had been this journey throughout so much of my life. And I was in a really happy, healthy place, I thought, in so many ways, as far as like, just more stable than I had been in the past. As far as work goes, I was in a really great relationship. Like, I just felt like there was no reason for me to be struggling that I could see before I could like point to, oh, this was like a toxic relationship. And this was, there were these other stresses. But I thought my life is kind of like on the surface looking like it's going pretty well. But what happened was I had gone through an eating disorder in my late teens and early 20s, and had moved past it, like considered myself pretty much like recovered. I wasn't wanting to lose weight at all. I didn't have any of those desires. And yet I was so fixated on diet pills and these like stimulant energy drinks. And I couldn't figure out why this kind of like crutch that was such a big part of my disordered eating was calling to me all the time. I even ordered online these pills that you can't, because what happens is they become illegal because people have all these horrible effects. And so I was like in the dark, like Googling, and I'm like, is this an addiction? Like, what is this? And so I went to see a therapist, and I think that on session 1, she kind of sensed what was really at play there, that I think she figured I had ADHD, but it took a few sessions before she brought it up to me. And then what she did was she started guiding me through different questions, and then she did like a full assessment. But the assessment itself was so validating because it just felt like she was reading my diary or something. I'm like, how do you know so many things about me? I like scored better on that test than any test in my life. Like A+. Got them all.
I felt the same way. And it was, those hilarious aha moments when I was having my assessment. Because my assessment was just a conversation with my GP for half an hour. It wasn't I didn't have like the really long 4-hour psych assessments. But she was asking me these questions where she was asking me about like what I feel like when I'm sitting in traffic, and, questions where I'm like, I'm not hyperactive. I don't know what you're talking about. And then I'm like, oh, right. When I sit in traffic, I want to rip the steering wheel out of the dashboard and throw it out the window. And I'm like, I see where we're going with this. Yeah. So now did you, so your therapist was asking you these questions, and then what was the next step?
So I can't remember if she's flat out said you have ADHD. She asked me if I would want to have this assessment for ADHD because she suspected it was at play. And so after this longer assessment, she diagnosed me, and I felt so excited. It really felt like this mysterious puzzle from my whole life. Like, I felt like I had this secret. Like, no, you don't understand. There's something wrong with me. I cringe a little when I say that now, because I don't think there's something wrong with me. But I did for decades. And so validating. And then I went to see a psychiatrist because she thought that I would be a potentially a very good candidate for medication. By that point, I already had so many tools in place out of necessity because I'd had such a rocky adulthood so far. I could list so many, challenges that I'd had with finances, with impulsivity. I got engaged on a first date. There are just so many things. And so I ended up going to see a psychiatrist, and the day I took medication for the first time, I took my first daytime nap probably since I was a newborn. I didn't nap as a toddler. Like I was really, really always on the move as a little kid, and sleep had always been a big challenge for me. And so I learned how to sleep once I had medication. But like I said, I already also had all these lifestyle measures in place. I'd already learned that I need exercise for my brain more than anything else. I knew that sleep loss was really problematic for me. Like it really affected me, but I would just still, I would get so like hyper from exhaustion. And so nobody really kind of understood that I was really struggling with this. There were just so many different factors that no matter what I did with my life, I think so many people, especially women, you know, we push so hard to try to be successful and good. You know, there's like this good girl thing I grew up, I think, around, where we have to have this moral value. We have to achieve, we have to meet these different benchmarks. And I struggled in all these things that felt so basic. And so medication really, really was a total game changer for me. It made me very emotional, because I've heard others say too, it's like putting the glasses on. It's more than that, but there is something that's like, oh, not only am I now allowed to be here, like I felt so validated that, oh, this is how your brain is. That is how you're supposed to be in this world. But then also that there were these different treatments that could be really helpful and that have been helpful. It's just been incredible. I mean, just totally changed everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of women, especially with internalized hyperactivity, we don't realize that's not how everybody thinks. So we don't make that connection that this is internalized hyperactivity, because I'm like, I just assume everybody thinks this way, and everybody is, you know, tormented by songs and thoughts and lyrics and all of these things all at once. And so it's really kind of coming to that understanding that it doesn't, you know, that there are other ways of being. And medication is like that, right? Like so many times we talk about that taking that first stimulant medication, and everything's so quiet, and just being like, oh my goodness, this is what other people are like.
Yeah. Totally profound.
Now, going back to this idea of like, what's wrong with me too. I mean, I think that's a theme that we talk about a lot in this podcast, and how, you know, even the diagnosis of depression and anxiety, which is so many of us are diagnosed with that, with those mood disorders or similar mood disorders. I felt that way too, which was like, my life is great. Like objectively, my life is fine. I have a happy marriage and kids, and like why do I insist on being depressed? And I used to feel like, what's wrong with me that I insist on being depressed? Mm. It was one more thing that I felt like, what's wrong with me, right?
Yes.
and then it's like, well, now I feel like a terrible person, so now I am depressed. And it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. And it bothers me that so many of us have had this similar experience with therapists, where there's not that curiosity in terms of what is underlying the depression and anxiety. It's mostly just like, you're depressed. That's who you are. And you kind of deal with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. Yeah. I had been diagnosed with depression, and I don't know if I was diagnosed with anxiety, definitely struggled with it. I had a therapist and a psychiatrist both thought that I had bipolar. Like there were so many things that never fit. And a lot of times it wasn't this thoughtful diagnosis either. Yeah. Like what is underneath it? And so for me, I know some people have, multiple diagnoses that are all very legitimate, but my depression and anxiety just like went away essentially. I mean, I think I have a normal level of, quote unquote, normal level of anxiety now, you know, about certain things, and certainly residual from growing up and feeling misunderstood and all these things. But I remember being on antidepressants, and nothing ever really helped or worked for me. And I just, couldn't figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got stuck in that thought cycle with antidepressants, where I thought, I'm still depressed. So if it's this bad on the antidepressants, imagine how bad it'll be off of them, which is, and because my doctor was always like, well, let's up the dose. And so I sort of bought into that idea that without them, I would be way worse off. So I have to stay on them, as opposed to ever thinking like, maybe this isn't it, right? Maybe we should try something else. But I think it plays into a lot of that narrative that we have in our lives, which is like, I just got to try harder. I just got to work harder. That we're the problem, not the drug or the system or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's true. It's really true. Yeah. Medications, some of them, like antidepressants, made a lot of my symptoms worse. So I was just like, but again, I would then get another medication on top of it or something. At one point I just felt kind of robotic. I was like, something is just, it's wild.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you mentioned that you were a hyperactive kid, so you kind of related to that. Looking back over your childhood, after your diagnosis, what were some of those signs where you were like, oh, it was clearly ADHD all along?
Oh, gosh. Well, okay. So in addition to the constant movement, I was extremely talkative when I was little. And this actually really makes me laugh now. And I think it's kind of endearing. I'd love to hear the perspective of other folks who were there. But so I grew up in Minnesota, and in a really kind of like quiet Scandinavian suburban community. And there was this family. I had a friend who was my age in the family, and they would invite me over to dinner every now and then. And they were really, really like shy, quiet folks. And I was so excited to go there because they would just let me talk. So at dinner, I would start talking as soon as I sat down. And I would tell stories, and I would be all over the place, and I would just talk and talk. Like, I thought I was entertaining them all the way until the end of the dinner. So that was one thing, which I'm really lucky that my parents did not try to change that in me. They really approached, I have 4 siblings who are not ADHD folks, and they really embraced kind of let them be who they are, which I love, but not all teachers did. So puberty was really, really difficult for me. And I used to think that everyone had these extremely difficult puberties later on. And now I realize, hormones and ADHD played a big role in that. So I went to a really, really dark place emotionally when I was in middle school, and I think probably was dealing with major depression that was residual from unmanaged ADHD. And that was really, really, really hard. And then I developed an eating disorder. And now I see, oh my goodness, I was trying to change my brain chemistry. I was hyper-focusing on something that was not healthy. I was trying to, quote unquote, fix something in me and trying to be a better person by meeting these different standards. I mean, I went into the modeling industry. And so it's kind of an extreme example of trying to like be what I had learned from magazines and TV, what like a woman should be. And then, like I said, into adulthood, a lot of impulsivity, moving all over the place. It was interesting when I get really passionate about something, my hyperfocus would become somewhat debilitating at times. And now it's much better where I love my hyperfocus, but it used to be really difficult. I could only do the thing I was hyper-focused on. And like I said, sometimes it was not very healthy. And the eating disorder got very, very severe. I was living in Paris and modeling there when I was diagnosed. I collapsed when I was going for a run. And no one in all of my treatments, no one asked me about anything related to ADHD or during my diagnoses. So that was another interesting thing. That, and the other thing they didn't ask me about was my sexuality. And so those two things were the kind of like the huge missing pieces in my life. I realized I had sexual shame too. So those two things helped me, like realizing I had ADHD and then also embracing my sexuality, saved my life really.
Wow. Okay. Well, that was a lot. Where
it
like,
was.
Where do I know? Well, but that's how our lives would play out, right? Like it's like you see, and it's just like, oh my God, it's like every rock underneath every rock. You're like, oh, there it is. Oh my God, there it is. Yeah. And like so many of us have a history with disordered eating of some kind. And I think back to puberty was when, I went on my first diet at the age of 14 because I was suddenly, my body was changing and I felt really, really uncomfortable with becoming an adult. And I really wanted to rail against that. And unfortunately, you know, my mom was like, I see how unhappy you are. Let's go on a diet together. And it became this like bonding thing between the two of us. And that started this life, 30 years of disordered eating and binge eating, not realizing how common disordered eating is among neurodivergents. And I want to find out from you what you think is behind that, because I feel like there is that control element, right? Where you feel so out of control at certain times in your life, and puberty is one of the biggest ones for women. And you're just just trying desperately to gain control, and eating is one of the easiest, most immediate ways in which we can kind of feel like we're controlling ourselves and our environment. Why do you think disordered eating is so rampant with neurodivergents in general? That's a big question, I know.
No, that's okay. I think you're so right. There are many layers to it. I think on one like really basic level, I think that a lot of us who have ADHD, who are neurodivergent, we have big appetites in general for like life, for like what we're into. And so we live in a culture that has a really distorted, wonky relationship with food already, right? So we are always exposed to these different messages about dieting and restriction and trends that are, the healthy lifestyle plan that's just like another diet and all these things. And I think that I know for me as a kid, I was just like a bottomless pit. I just wanted to eat all the time. And I remember being teased about that. Just like, oh, just give it to her. She'll eat it. If somebody doesn't want to eat that. And so I think some of it comes from, we become self-conscious of having perhaps a passion for food.
Appetites or in general.
Yes. Yeah. Appetites in general. Absolutely. And then I think self-esteem plays a huge role because, as you know, like low self-esteem is so prevalent in people with ADHD. And so I think whenever you have low self-esteem, you are, unfortunately, it's like this spiral that can snowball, where you already feel not great about yourself, and maybe you go to food for instant gratification. You might struggle with friendships. I know I did. And it's like this thing that's not going to judge you. And there is something about, I think, brain chemistry and this desire to either restrict or change something. And I know there's some research around this, but I do think that there's something around trying to kind of level out your own brain. I know that bodybuilders often have ADHD. There's something, because it really does affect your hormones. And so exercising is healthy, but we can take it to an extreme, for sure. And I think also, I think that I was subconsciously trying to address something that felt off in my brain. I really do. And that started in high school when I was in my teens. And so, and then you get praised for it. And of course, if you have rejection sensitivity and you're used to judgments from other people of not being normal or whatnot, it feels really good for people to notice changes in your body. Even when they're unhealthy, we sometimes hear them as, oh, well, great, thanks. Somebody's noticing me. I don't feel so invisible now. So there's so many reasons, but yeah, there's such a huge correlation. I personally get dysmorphic about my body too. Like medication really helped me with that. Not like seeing myself more accurately, but also not even thinking as much about my appearance.
That's really interesting. I haven't explored that a lot. But because for me, so much of it has to do with exposure therapy and working on shame issues. So, but it would be interesting to think about how medication plays into that. And it's also true. I think there's also like we go hard or go home, right? And I think that, so we live in extremes a lot of the time. And I think that has to do with our dopamine, why so many of us either were diagnosed or wondered if we had bipolar, because we're this pendulum. But also, like, I think about dieting too, and just this efficiency mindset that a lot of us have with ADHD, where we're really impatient. So I would always get trapped in the if I'm going to lose this much weight at 1,200 calories, imagine how much I'll lose if I half that. Right. And like always trying to do these ridiculous calculations. I'm going to have to put a trigger warning on the episode for that one. But like, just we go through these like real, I feel like we want to push things always to the limits, and that has to be dopamine, but it's, because I've talked about that with just exercise too. And like, I can't just exercise. I have to like exercise to the point where I injure myself, or I have to like challenge myself every single time of, I did it this, if I did it in half an hour, I have to do it in 29 minutes today. And like, there's never any just sense of consistency or being, okay with being leveled off.
Absolutely. And at the same time, this disconnect with our own bodies. I know you've talked about that, I think in a recent episode. It's like, I certainly felt that too. So it's strange. We're working so hard on trying to change or optimize something that we don't feel connected to. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. And I think also, I know you've spoken about this too with the modeling agency that, or just modeling in general, there was such a sense of validation and acceptance there. And maybe it wasn't the healthiest, but it felt like this performative element that's been that, when you talk about like talking, doing this theater and all of that ways in which we put on a show and are very comfortable with like the performance part of distancing who we actually are from what we're showing to other people. I think a lot of us have a tendency to like have that duality. So basically, I think a lot of people think that's what masking is, and that's not masking, but I do think it speaks to the ways in which we try to put on a show a lot of the time when we're in certain situations. And so it feels like modeling as an industry would really play into that.
Absolutely. And it's really freeing to step out of yourself when you feel tortured inside yourself. I felt so free when I was either on stage or I was on set. I felt like I could step out of who I am and become this other person who had value. It was so wild to me. And at the same time was not seeing myself the way that other people did. So I would look at photos of me and I almost couldn't recognize myself. I'm like, what kind of weird camera magic is this? That, it was wild. And yeah, lots of validation. I mean, people really, really praise you it seemed like I was on the top of my career. In some ways I was when I was so sick. But so much of that stemmed from that emotional turmoil from my ADHD going unnoticed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember feeling that way just at my lowest weight, at the height of my disordered eating and binge eating. I was chain smoking. And I remember people always saying like, oh, you must feel so healthy. They were always commenting on how healthy I was. And I was like, you have no idea.
Yes. Oh, yes.
It's so messed up. So now so you were in Paris, your TED Talk, you talked about collapsing in the streets of Paris and very poignantly talking about coming to with a mouthful of dirt. And your first thought was, does dirt have calories?
Have calories? Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, talk about the extremes. Like at the time that didn't seem unusual to me. It's the way I thought. But I remember later reflecting on it and sharing that story with people and just opening up in therapy and sharing what my thoughts were. And it's such an extreme, it's a form of, and I use this in a clinical sense, it's a form of insanity. When you get that sick, your mind can't function in any capacity, well, whether you have ADHD or not. I mean, the malnourished brain is a very, very sick brain. So yeah, I was diagnosed when I came to. I'd been running along the Seine River and it was like so beautiful outside. And I remember there's like colors in the sky and it just was so beautiful. And I felt such deep contrast. I felt dark inside. I felt sick and I knew something was wrong, but I had no idea it was an eating disorder because I had absorbed these myths too. Like first I was diagnosed with anorexia and I thought that meant you don't eat. I thought you don't eat at all if you have anorexia. But anyway, I ended up going back to Minnesota, where I'm from, for treatment. And the treatment really was not doing anything. I mean, I should say I was not progressing, because it's not that the treatment didn't have value. I think there was a lot of good things that were happening, but I just, I think that if I had been diagnosed then or earlier, I would not have nearly lost my life, because anorexia has the highest mortality rate of all psychiatric diseases. And so I feel very lucky to have made it through.
Well, I feel like traditional eating disorder treatment is not very neurodiversity affirming. And I feel like that's a much wider conversation, but because disordered eating is so rampant in the neurodivergent community, and many of us feel like the typical cut and dry treatment is aggressively ineffective. And so I feel like there's a missing link there in terms of what we're really like, getting to the root of what is causing a lot of this behavior that's not woven into the treatment modalities.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear that a lot. I feel like it's a shame, because then you come out of it feeling like, well, like you just said, like, there's still that sense of like, well, I didn't do the work, or what's wrong with me that this didn't work for me. And we get back to that place of, I was given this solution and I couldn't figure it out. And so therefore I'm the problem, not, the treatment was not the right treatment for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I completely agree.
And then that brings me to sex, because I feel like, again, a lot of the issues around sex and the shame around sex comes back to that question of what's wrong with me, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
And I loved I feel like the book Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, both my husband and I read it. It was so life-changing. It changed our relationship. And that's the crux of the book, right? Which is whatever you're experiencing, whatever works for you or doesn't work for you, that's normal. Everything is normal. There's no not normal. And so there's nothing wrong with you. And I feel like, why don't we hear that message more in our lives?
It's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so true. And that was actually the turning point for me, was in my eating disorder. So before I was diagnosed with ADHD, this was a good 8 to 10 years before, but I was in eating disorder treatment and I needed something else to do, because I had come from Paris and New York and London to this small town where all I did was think about my eating disorder. It was terrible. And so I took this class on the psychology of women. And one day the professor stood before us and said, "Today we're going to talk about sex." And it was like, what? I had, as a very curious, talkative person, I had never really talked about sex, even to the person I'd been having it with. And so that really was a huge game changer for me, because it did start to help me chip away at that shame. And I stopped in that moment, stopped wanting to brutalize my body. I realized, the shame isn't it isn't something wrong with me. It's something wrong with this world. There's all these messages and these things that I didn't learn and that I did learn. And I certainly had a lot of healing to do, but it was totally game changing. And I do see a huge correlation too between sexual shame and neurodiversity and eating disorders. They all are just kind of like this toxic soup that doesn't have to be toxic.
Yeah, right. I know. I had a very puritanical upbringing, and it was funny because long after I was married and had kids, I was sitting down with my parents and was like, it's funny, my high school never had sex ed. Everybody talks about sex ed, and my high school didn't have it. I don't know why. And my mom was like, "Oh, they had it. We just signed the form that you weren't allowed to go." And I was like, what? I was so betrayed, even though I obviously have had kids at this point, but I was so betrayed hearing this so many years later. And I was so angry. And I said, why would you do that to me? And she said, well, we figured your husband would teach you everything you needed to know. And I was like, spoiler alert, that's not how it ended up. But I was just But, so I had a very similar experience to you, and just in terms of being a very late bloomer and having to be how I had to learn everything. I didn't know what a clitoris was until I was 25. I didn't even know. And I just feel it was so embarrassing to admit that. But also feeling well, nobody told me
Yes, it's not your fault. Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, the clitoris wasn't in medical text until the 90s.
It's
The
insane.
90s. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, there still are huge gaps, and then the generations before know less than we do. So it's really hard to turn that around.
I know, right? And it's my daughter's 16, and like from the as old as she since she could talk, I've been like telling her all about the female sex organs and like masturbation, the importance of masturbation, and all of this because I'm like trying to right the wrongs of my own upbringing. And of course, she's just like she just eye rolls and doesn't want to hear
Mom.
any of it. But right?
That's
but
great, though.
Well, I just think it's so important because to talk about female sexuality in terms of what we want and what we deserve and what we that it's about our pleasure, because so much of the narrative is about what what men can get away with and what you'll allow, and whether they'll like you or dislike you based on the choices you make. And it's never like we're never even progressive, sex education in high school, if that even exists. I don't think it does. But like, it's always, like you've said in the past, like it's always about how dangerous it is and how to abstain and not end up down these terrible paths. And it has nothing to do with pleasure.
It's so true. Yeah. And it continues on. I mean, so many states don't require sex ed. It's not mandated, or it doesn't have to be scientifically accurate, which they're trying to leave room for, like religious values. You can have religious values and you should still learn scientific facts about your body.
Yeah. So now, how did you end up talking about sex so openly and making this kind of your MO?
Yeah. So that big aha moment in that college class, I really haven't stopped talking about sex then, I don't think. Of course, I didn't do it publicly right away, but I was like on a rampage about this. So it just flipped a lid off of me. And then I ended up going back into fashion and then acting, and that led into writing. And acting brought me to Los Angeles, and then I realized that writing was really my passion. So I built this health writing career, and I was writing for different publications, and I had a blog that was very health oriented. And then around age 30, I discovered self-pleasure for me, like for the first time. I even wrote a paper in that college class called Why I Don't Need to Masturbate. I, at that time, considered myself like a very sexual person, very, I had pleasurable sex. I didn't struggle with orgasms. I felt fortunate in that way, but I had been basing my idea of what my sexuality was on another person. Like, I hadn't even thought about the shape that I still had. And so one night, my longtime partner was away, and I started to feel really blah. And I ended up discovering through a series of events that, oh my goodness, I'm actually really horny right now. And so I decided to go and find this like sex toy that was a secret, joke gift kind of thing that some friends had given us, and it was still in the packaging and everything. So I played with myself, and it was like, to bring myself to climax was so emotional for me. I mean, it was very fun and pleasurable, but immediately after, I just fell down in tears because I realized that there still was this residual shame, and also this big missing piece of my life that not everyone needs to masturbate, of course, but it's not that I wasn't masturbating because I made a decision not to. It's like the decision had been made for me, from when I was just a tiny little kid. I remember my grandmother, I was asking questions like kids do, like, what's down there? And my sweet cookie bacon grandmother turned into like Satan or something. She was so upset and scolded me and yelled at me, never touch that. And I didn't even realize that I had carried that message with me. And so that's when I realized, because prior to that, I had been approached by different people in the literary industry who were like, well, why don't you write a memoir about, the eating disorder? And I'm like, that doesn't feel like my story. Like, I know it's a part of it, but there's so much more to this. There's something else that's there for me. And that moment of realization really came with that self-pleasure experience where I knew that I needed to do more in that exact space. So I launched a blog series, which was really scary at first. I mean, I was very excited, but the moment I hit published, I was like sweating and like shaking because I had this blog following, which included my father. Like, you know, people were getting posts about like, you know, vegetables and my dog and writing. And then I'm like, girl boner. So I called the series Girl Boner, which was a term that was kind of an inside joke for myself since that awkward sex ed class where I remember learning about quote unquote male pleasure and sitting there waiting for something good for somebody who had a body like mine. So as soon as I heard the word boner, like kids talking, and realized what that was, I thought to myself, what about girl boners? So it had been this joke in my own head. And I was like, okay, so this term that I love that's just feels so fun to me and is so, you just hear it and it brings up myth busting, which is what I wanted to do. And so I launched the series on my blog, and it led to so many different things, but my advocacy, my business, my podcast, which is Girl Boner Radio, which is like my passion and my joy and kind of my whole life now.
That's incredible. And I think, you know, it really lends to one of the ADHD superpowers, which is self-disclosure.
Oh, yes. I love how you put it that. Thank you for saying it in such a positive way. Yes. Yes.
But I used to always think that that was one of my terrible traits where I was like, I always say too much. I'm an open book. I used to compare myself to Sophia from the Golden Girls where I'm like, I think I had a stroke. I don't know how to self-censor. And now I'm like, it's brought me all the good in life, which is I can't shut up about myself. But in a way that I think is really validating for other people to hear, right? Like I think it really speaks to our desire for validation and our desire to feel normal, right? And to answer a lot of those, you know, to rail against that question of what's wrong with me.
Yes. And you're helping so many people by speaking up. Like you said, this thing that felt like a flaw it so often is our superpower. I remember trying to talk to some of my friends about sexuality before I launched Girl Boner. And there were times where they were just like kind of stunned that it didn't feel like I was talking about sex like it was the weather. You know, I just thought, oh, this is, now that I realize there's no shame in it, let's just talk about it like it's normal because it is. And that is not where the world is in many places. And for a lot of us, and I had to learn to filter that a bit. But once I launched Girl Boner, it clicked things together where I was like, oh, there's actually a reason or at least a purpose I can assign to this way of what some people would consider oversharing. And of course, what ends up happening, since I interview folks, so many of them are neurodivergent because who's going to get on a podcast and talk about their boners, right? Like oversharers are my favorite people in the world. I just love you all. Please give yourself a hug. I just think it's the best.
Well, it's funny because I am such an open book on this podcast. And one of the things that terrifies me is talking about sex because it's not just me. It's my relationship with my husband and I want to respect his privacy. And so then I get like really, really concerned where I'm like, oh, I've said too much, yeah. And is he going to be okay with this? Because I do, I want to be respectful of his privacy. How do you manage that?
That is a great question. And I so relate because my partner is the opposite as far as talking loudly in public about sex. Yeah. So you get it. And so he's very supportive of what I do. He loves what I do. So I'm very grateful for that. And I was with him when I launched Girl Boner initially. And so when I brought it up to him, I said, this is what he knows me. Like if I'm going to do something, it's not like, what do you think he knows I'm going to do it? Like and so he just said, this is so you. Like he was so proud and so excited. And also blushes a lot. But we did decide together that I would talk about my sexuality. I can talk about my sexual experiences. I can talk about a sexual experience that I'd had with him, but I'm not going to say it was him, And so the only times that I have shared specifically about him, and this was a big one. I mean, I think this took a lot for him, and I'm very grateful. The first chapter in my Girl Boner book is called The Orgasm That Changed My Life. And it's my self-pleasure experience, but leading up to it, I'm having all of these fantasies and daydreams like about him. And so I'm talking about him, it's about me, but I'm talking about him. So, and it was a big deal, I think, for him to agree to that. And I know that that's been challenging for him. But the nice thing is it has given me, I think, a sense of privacy that I didn't realize would be helpful to me, because now, you know, I've traveled around speaking, and because the world is such that it is, and we still do live in a pretty sex negative culture with all these mixed messages, people think that if you talk about sex that you want to have sex with them, or, you know, there's just all these wonky things that come up. And so it's actually been a really lovely thing, because our intimate life feels very intimate. And so I don't talk about him, but it's a muscle. I would make little notes for myself. And I remember asking him, should I just say it was like someone named Frank? And he's like, no, that's even worse. Like, one of my friends is going to listen and call me and be like, who's Frank? So it's funny. And like, one of the top Googles for my name is like my name and husband, or like my name and partner, because people want to know. And he's private on social media too. So like, this mysterious being is a wonderful guy, everyone, but private.
Yeah, I know. That's so funny, because I feel like I know that he has staff who listen to this podcast. And so I'm like, he is a very, very private person. But I also I know that we have, you know, there are a lot of people that we both know who listen to this podcast. So I always have to be like, oh God, what did I say? Because it just tumbles out of me so quickly. But you're right. He knows. I mean, he loves me and supports my personality, and wouldn't be with me this long if he didn't. So I think he gets it.
Our husbands could be at little support groups together.
Oh, I know, right? I've said that before, where I'm like, there needs to be a support group for husband or for partners of people who are recently diagnosed, who it's all they want to talk about is, oh my God, did you know this? Did you know this? Like, he has to listen to me all the time talking about ADHD. So he's kind of an expert now.
I bet.
But I think, you know, that idea, I think that like that concept with the book Come As You Are, and why it was so life-changing, was because it allowed us to really start to look at like, what does she calls it, like your on-ramps, right? Like what are some
your
of the
gas
reasons
pedal and your
the gas pedal and the brakes, and all of this idea of like, what do we need to really help us focus in? And so some of these things, some of those aspects around sex that are really, really difficult for people with ADHD, like, you know, having a really hard time not thinking about the grocery list when you're trying to climax, you know, and like really like not being able to regulate how you're thinking and being able to focus in the moment and stuff like that. And all the shame that comes around feeling like, oh, I'm not in the mood right now, or maybe I'm too much in the mood, or like all of these ways in which we feel like, what's wrong with me? Absolutely.
And there's a wonderful brain scientist, Nan Wise, who did a study where she looked at brain activity during pleasure and arousal. And she found with her team that you can have a very busy mind. You don't have to slow your mind down. You don't have to like get your thoughts away to have pleasure or orgasm. And I just thought that was a really important study, simply to give that idea. Like, it's normal. It's okay. If you're somebody who thinks about a lot of things during sex or during arousal, that's okay. It doesn't have to, you don't have to try to like fight those thoughts, which just makes them more invasive, I think. But also, sex tends to be a place for some ADHD folks, and some, I would say many, where it is one place where they can become mindful and become very present, because even with ADHD during orgasm, it's really difficult to be thinking about the grocery list or your shame. I mean, our confidence and our body confidence and our sense of self can strengthen so much by having that pleasure, whether we're with a partner or not.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And being able to reduce stimulus is, I think, really important. That was something that we learned over time, which was like, I don't understand people who, you know, and obviously everybody has their own journey, but I would always hear stories of people who have like the family bed with their kids are in their bed with them. And I'm like, how are you intimate with kids in your bed? I don't get it. But like, you know, really, really struggling with managing home life and children, and like finding ways to really be present is something that we've had to work really, really hard at. And oftentimes it ends up being things like, we'll go to a hotel sometimes because it's It's the only way that we can leave our phones and the dog and the kitchen and the kid. And like, that's a really, really wonderful way for us to be present. And it, you know, it's expensive, but it's the best. We have such a good time.
Yeah.
And so it's a treat that we do for ourselves where we're like, yeah, this is like a date night on steroids.
Yes. I love that. I love that.
I've shared too much. He's going to be mad at me. But anyway,
or his coworkers will be very moved and proud and excited. They're going to cheer for you both
too, right?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, and it's such a good example too for folks to hear that, because I think that's such a common thing, you know. And I think another thing that can be really important if you're neurodivergent is, and for people who aren't too, because first of all, the brain is the most impactful sex organ, whether you have ADHD or not. And not having ADHD brings its own set of challenges to your brain, right? We can be very, very passionate, like pleasure obviously could be a big drive for us. Like there's so many wonderful things that we can bring to sex and intimacy that we may not have if we were neurotypical. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then I think also it's really important to give yourself permission to have intimate time for pleasure by yourself and or with a partner or partners when a time of day that feels good to you. I think that there's a lot of pressure around like right before bed, you have to have sex then. Some people enjoy that. That does not work for me at all. And I think that if you've ever struggled with sleep, if I have sex right before bed, I'll be up all night long. And then I feel terrible the next few days. And it just throws this whole thing into this weird spirally thing. And so for me, like late afternoon is so much better. And so I think it's really important to just give yourself permission to be like, what do I actually want? Not what can I do to try to be like this image of a sex person that I have, which may or may not have anything to do with what other people are doing. And even if it does, it's not you. You don't have to be like other people.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I find an interesting paradox with ADHD is, you know, so many of us have that desire for control, feeling so out of control in our lives that we see these patterns where we really try to like zero in and try to control things and solve the puzzles and like become perfectionists around certain things. But I think there's also this paradox with sex and it being in a relationship where we're very uncomfortable with being in the driver's seat. We're really uncomfortable with asking and sort of exerting control in a relationship. And a sexual relationship is all about asking. It's all about selfishness, right? In some ways, it's really about being able to ask for what you need. And that's really, a lot of us struggle with that. I think, especially women, which is like, I'm more comfortable with somebody else making decisions, whether it's what we get for takeout or, you know, but all of those ways where it's like, I'd rather be the one who's disappointed than the one who disappoints. So somebody else needs to make all the decisions. And that kind of just doesn't work when it comes to sex.
That is such a good point. That's one reason that I would recommend for folks who get really stuck in that realm, especially if your partner also struggles with initiating or asking for what they want. Have you heard about yes, no, maybe lists, or have you ever?
Ooh, no, please explain.
So you can make your own, or you can find them online. There's one in one of my books, but basically, and there's different themes, but there are 3 columns: yes, no, and maybe. And then on the side, it lists all these different activities, and both you and your partner would fill it out. And for each item, let's say you have one that is like general sex stuff, because you can also find like kink ones and BDSM ones and all these different things. But let's say it has like long makeout kissing. Are you a yes, a no, or a maybe? And a maybe just means like, not for now, maybe it'll change. And then maybe another one could be having sex in a different room. Maybe it's a little bit of role playing. Maybe it's, you know, you just list all these different things, and then you just compare your charts together. So it's a conversation without being like, excuse me, but this is what I want, or try to say it in a sexy way, which could feel intimidating if you're not like, you know, it just doesn't, if it doesn't feel like you to just bring up some dirty talk during sex or talk about it outside the bedroom. They can be really helpful because you'll see where things match, where you both have yeses. And then the maybes are the ones that you would talk about. But then you have a guide to kind of like, oh, well, it's a worksheet. It's not like I made the decision. It's like it was handed to us. But they can be really helpful and also just give you a lot of good ideas. There's so many different things you can try.
Right? Yeah, I remember. What was the book? Oh God, I'm not going to remember it now because I'm terrible with names. She's a really famous sex uh, couples therapist.
Esther Perel, maybe?
Esther Perel, yes.
Yeah.
And one of the things with her book was Mating in the Wild. Is that what it's called?
Oh, Mating in Captivity.
Mating in Captivity. Whoops. God, I'm so
I do
terrible.
that too. Like the exact opposite word will come out. But it made me think of it. So good team.
Right. But it was like Mating in the Wild, where she talks about kind of figuring out how to make things new. Right. And the novelty element and role playing and some of that stuff. But it was really difficult. I was like, I don't know what I'm into. I think that's a really difficult question for a lot of us. And where it would be nice to say, like, let me look at a list and what stirs something in me, as opposed to being like, let's try, I don't know, feathers. And then you bring a feather and you're like, no, now I feel like a failure again because they're not doing anything for me. So I think.
Right.
I think it'd be helpful to have a list of already created list where you could like check off things.
Absolutely. And if you try something and you don't like it, that is great information to have. I mean, it's great. And also sex is supposed to be fun and messy and weird and funny and strange. So like, it's just part of life. Like if you're not making a mess sometimes, if you're not having a faux pas, like some sort of strange thing happen, you know, maybe something's missing because that's just normal for everyone. No matter what kind of brain you have, sex is going to be wonky sometimes. It'll be hilarious sometimes. I mean, yeah, I think the funny adventures are some of my favorites. And whether they're orgasmic or not, whether they end up with lots of pleasure or not, I think it's such a beautiful form of intimacy to be vulnerable and laugh and be goofy with a partner.
Yeah, very well said. And I think once we can get out of a place of shame or feeling like there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, I think it can be really freeing. Yeah,
absolutely.
So now, and I love another thing about ADHD is you're like, oh, and I also wrote a fiction book.
Oh, yes. I did.
When was that? Tell me about that.
Yeah.
Your novel.
Yeah, so I wrote a psych thriller called In Her Shadow. Thank you for asking about it. I don't get asked about it very often because, you know, I'm doing this sexuality work. And so if somebody brings up what books have you written and I mention a novel, they just kind of like don't know what to say. So thank you because you get it. So I, like I said, knew I didn't really want to write a memoir, but once I really, because I have a love affair with my work, like when I find something I love doing in work, it feels like this romantic, incredibly passionate love affair. And so I even called my end of acting career like my divorce from acting. I wouldn't quit acting until I fell in love with something more. And so I fell in love with writing. And I just declared, I am a writer, and I just wouldn't stop writing. And I knew I needed to get my own story out, but I didn't want to write an eating disorder memoir for lots of different reasons. And so I thought, well, what do I really love reading? And I love reading psych thrillers. So this isn't actually a genre, but I wrote like an anorexia psych thriller because I thought it is such a scary disease. And that's something that gets missed a lot. People think it's about, you know, it's all about just control and discipline. And they imagine these like ballerinas with lots of discipline. And that was not me. And also, even if that is you, the inner turmoil is so much more. It's the closest thing to a horror movie in your own life than I can imagine anything is. And so I decided to write a psych thriller that has an eating disorder element to it and lots of different twists. And it takes place in Minnesota, again, where I'm from. And there's a therapist in it. And it was really fulfilling to write. And actually, when I finished it, this is very classic ADHD, I think. People tell you what is like the natural, normal next thing to do. And so my agent was like, when is the sequel coming? Right. And so I'm trying so hard to be this good, diligent author. And I sit down and I'm like working on the sequel. And the way that I compulsively wrote the first one, I was just like forcing myself to write the sequel. And then I played with myself that night with a toy, and I realized girl boner was my whole life, and it completely terrified my agent, who was this like very nice guy who very shy about sex. And so it was like this explosion of what do I do with this writer? And so I got a different agent because everyone says your second book sells your first book. Like, you need to keep writing the series. You need to keep going. And I was like, yeah, but I can't. I literally can't. My passion is my teacher. It's my compass. It's my guide, and I'm going with it. And so I did. It took a while I think from the inception of my Girl Boner book to publishing, it took like 6 years. But I'm really glad that I went that route, and I still love thrillers. I still love fiction, and I could see myself wanting to do more of it in the future. But I just don't put pressure on myself to have passion for something until it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I love it because it's like, yeah, you got it out, and now you're on to something new and interesting.
Yeah.
Now with the Girl Boner book, is it a collection of your blog entries, or how were you able to put that together?
Yeah. So when I wanted to launch Girl Boner, the reason I did the blog series was because as a writer, I was thinking in books, and I was like, well, I need to have a platform. You know, now we more often say brands, but at the time it was like, build your platform. You have to prove to readers and publishers that you have an audience. And especially with a sex book, I knew that self-publishing would be much more challenging. And so I wanted a traditional publisher. I wanted to have help because so much of what we do gets pulled off the internet. We get blocked on Facebook for saying vulva. Like, it's a lot of drama. And so I wanted that like added legitimacy that can come with having a traditional publisher who could like knock down doors. And so the book itself is like, I'd written a proposal while I was doing the blog. And so the blog is separate, but there are a lot of common themes. And I start with sharing some of my own story, but then I actually include a lot of folks who I've interviewed for my podcast and their stories, so that it's a whole collection of folks who are identify as women or were reared as girls. And it covers everything from like mismatched libido to sex toys to there's journaling prompts in every section. And I tried to make it really fun because I think sex is supposed to be fun and silly, like I said. And so often it can feel like this really heavy topic. And so while I do address shame a lot, and I do address things around, trauma, which unfortunately is really common too, I want people to have some lightness and some fun and to create their own journey.
Yeah, I love that. I also talk about sex like it's the weather. Just ask my teenage daughter, and and I wouldn't have it any other way, right? I remember once, I think she was quite young, or maybe it was even my son who's a bit younger. I don't know. One of them, we were watching a TV show and somebody talked about masturbation. And one of the kids was, my son was like, what's masturbation? And so it fell to my husband because he has to sort of deal with the male issues, right? And he looked at my son and he was like, it's having sex with yourself. And then went back to watching TV. And I was like, no. That's not the explanation we're going to give. And I like made him pause, and we had to have this whole conversation where everybody was unhappy and uncomfortable. But I was like, we need to normalize this. It was like so important. It's been, given my upbringing, I'm like, it's so important for me to normalize this. So
yes. Oh, thank you for doing that. So important.
Well, no, I mean, thank you. You're the one with the doing the heavy lifting out there. And now, do you work with people, or is it? I know you do public speaking, but other than coming to your website and getting your books, can people work with you, or?
Yeah, I'm not a coach or anything. But the best thing is probably my podcast is where I put most of my energy now. I'm also a journalist, so I write sexuality pieces for like Daily Ohm, and I do some ghostwriting for gynecologists. So you can find my articles on my website, augustmclaughlin.com. But if you want to hear about just a whole range of stories, on my podcast, I guide people through their own personal experiences. And so there's a huge range of and common themes too. But for folks who are like, I don't know what I'm into, it's actually a really good way to explore different desires and hear what people are into, what, different experiences that people have. And every story, there's a lot of like spicy true stories, but then there's also stories about like sexual self-embracement, sexual awakenings, which can happen all throughout our lives. I've had guests from age like 22 to 82. And yeah, it's really my heart and soul. And I put a lot of care into the content so that people can be entertained, but also learn something. So they have advice as well mixed in. But so that's Girl Boner Radio. And that's 3 words, girl space boner /radio.
I'll have a link to that in the show notes, of course, and to your books too.
Thank you.
And I think it's, I think vicarious learning is something that is really a wonderful way that we educate ourselves as neurodivergents, because I think it has that double component of being validating and affirming, but at the same time, like really informational, which really tickles all of our brain, our neural pathways.
Yes.
Because we're such like voracious learners. But I think there is something about the vicarious experience. It's probably, why anybody would listen to this podcast is because we're talking about our personal experiences, and everybody's nodding along, being like, you too? Oh my God, me too.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, if I just had to, I feel very passionate about preventing boredom for people because I cannot tolerate it. So it's one thing I love about your podcast is like, if it's something I can Google, I don't want a podcast about it. Like if it's what are the side effects of medication or what are the symptoms of ADHD, I can Google that. I want to hear voices and stories and super cool people. And so that's why I love what you're doing too. And that stays with us. The stories stay with us. I think they change the world.
Yeah. Great point. Well, thank you so much, August, for coming here and sharing your story and all of the fascinating things you've been doing and all of the different paths that have led you to who you are today. So I find that endlessly fascinating. So thank you so much. This was great.
My pleasure. Thank you, Katie. Thanks for the work you do.